and expanded inside sources.
So I remember when the news broke about 4 University of Idaho students who were murdered in their home while they slept, it seemed to be. And when Bryan Kohberger was arrested and he's been charged. So news yesterday, so that those murders actually happened in November of 2022. It's already been a year and a half. Yesterday, we got news that Bryan Kohberger has agreed to plead guilty on 4 murder charges, which means he won't be eligible for the death penalty. But it blindsided family members of the victim, like Steve Goncalves, I think, whose daughter Katie was killed on that day.
We were not prepared for this. We had no idea that this was going to happen. It's the opposite of what we wanted. I won't speak on all the family's parts, but I can 100%, because I was in the same room with them fighting against this decision with multiple families. This is not the majority.
That's unusual, Holly. And Idaho has a law very similar to Utah's, which requires, it's called part of what's called the Victims' Bill of Rights. It requires that victims be notified before. Now, I'm digressing a little bit. The victims be notified when significant stages are happening in a case. In other words, the trial's coming up. The defendant's about to plead guilty. The defendant's going to be sentenced. There's a preliminary hearing, things like that. But also importantly in that, they need to be notified if there's going to be a plea bargain. Now, that doesn't mean that the victims have the right to veto the plea bargain. It's not like a civil case where the victim is a party to the case. If you look at the pleading, it's the state of Idaho versus Bryan Kohberger.
Right.
The victims and their families are witnesses. They're victims. They're part of the case, but they're not parties to the case, like a civil case, like when we talked about the Retzlaff case yesterday.
Sure.
You've got the plaintiff and the defendant, and they both have input in how a case is resolved. But victims have the right to be notified, and the state has the obligation. It's a legal and moral obligation to at least notify them to what's going on. So what's odd in this case is not so much the plea bargain, because I do want to talk about that a little bit. The plea bargain seems like not the worst thing in the world, but the victims being blindsided by it and hearing about it seemingly in the news.
Mm-hmm. It sounded to me like they were notified that it was going to happen. Are you saying they should have been notified that they were in discussions about a plea bargain?
I think no. I'm taking it even further than that.
Okay.
They were notified that they were in discussions about a plea bargain.
Okay.
But when the plea bargain was actually offered, they should have told the victims, "We're going to offer a plea bargain that includes," and what happened here, he's going to plead guilty to 4 counts of murder plus a burglary charge, and agree to serve life in prison without parole,
Right.
and agree not to appeal anything. That's the plea bargain. And on its face, that seems not the worst thing in the world, but the victims had the right to be told about that. And so the state should have, and I don't know, we haven't heard from the state, we're just listening to the victims who are upset. The state should have sat down with the victims' families and said, here's what's on the table. We're likely to give him an offer of 4 life sentences. He'll never get out of prison.
Right.
He'll spend the rest of his life there, and he can't appeal. It's over. And they could have said, we don't like that. That's awful. Please don't do that. And the state would have said, well, we're going to anyway. And we appreciate your comments, and we're sensitive to that, but we're going to move forward. What they apparently did wrong, at least according to Steve Conclaves, is he said, we didn't even know what was going on. We just heard that there were some plea negotiations, and all of a sudden we hear, boom, he's going to get life in prison without possibility of parole. We wanted him executed. And so it's not. I don't know that it's the plea bargain as much as the victims didn't have the right to participate or be told about it.
Right, and so that's really, I guess it's another question of mine. First of all, I don't understand why, as a parent, why they would want to go through a jury trial. I mean, I think the outcome would be the same even when you're sentenced to death. Like we had a conversation about people on death row in Utah for decades, right? It really is the same type of sentence. Eventually, sometimes it ends in an execution, sometimes not. But I don't understand as a parent why they would want to put themselves through knowing all of the really gory details about these murders.
That's a good point, because had there been a trial, and it does not look like it's going to be, because it looks like Kohberger's going to plead guilty tomorrow.
Yeah.
Had there been a trial, one of the elements is that the Kohberger caused the death, and they would have had to put the medical examiner on. They would have testified to the findings, and some of these kids had what are called defensive wounds. In other words,
they woke up while they were
knew
being
something
stabbed.
was going on, and it was an incredible stabbing. 4 kids are killed. People were wondering how he could have done this, because it appears he was only in the house for a matter of minutes. But for the fact that he dropped a knife sheath at the scene that has his DNA on it, it would have been a hard case to prove. And he wasn't even caught until weeks later in
a different state,
Pennsylvania. And he's brought back here, and he's like, if you recall, he had his first court appearance. He wouldn't even say not guilty. The judge said, well, enter your not guilty plea for you. He's got this awful smirk on his face all the time. He's got a very aggressive lawyer. He's been pushing that case. And you're right. The families would have been hanging on the edge of their seat while the jury deliberates a month from now, because it was scheduled to be a 3 or 4 week trial.
I thought it was a 3-month trial.
Oh yeah, it could very well have been. I don't know. I can't imagine a case like this would take 3 months, but it would take whatever it takes, especially with 4 victims. But it would have been a long. You're right, 3 months. They'd set for it. I doubt it would have taken that long. Anyway, the family would have been sitting there, and more importantly, Holly, 10 years from now, when he's up for the review of his sentence, and the death penalty's on the table again, and another appeal is filed to the Idaho Supreme Court, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the United States Supreme Court.
We're
revisiting this again. And you get to the eve of the execution, and another appeal occurs. And if you recall this case in Utah recently, I think it was the Carter case, he'd been on death row for 40 years, and they decided that the prosecutor acted inappropriately, withheld evidence. The police had cut some deal with some victims that they didn't disclose, and they set his conviction aside. Yeah. Now, had he pled guilty to the murder and life without parole, he'd be serving life without parole. As it is, his conviction is set aside, and he's going to have a new trial. And I know that the county attorneys down there are scrambling to go, hey, are we going to be able to put a case together on this guy? Where are our witnesses 40 years later? And so that finality is worth something. But I do have to say this, and I was a prosecutor, Holly, for 8 years, and when we enacted the Victims' Bill of Rights was actually enacted while I was prosecuting, and we all thought, ugh, because you didn't have to do anything prior to that. You just cut a deal, and the victims are mad. You read about it in the paper the next day. Now you're required to talk to them, and you're required to get their input, and you're required to and the judge will ask when a prosecutor cuts a deal. The judge will say, Mr. or Ms. Prosecutor, are the victims consulted on this case, and how do they feel? Well, I talked to them, they're on board. Or I talked to them, they're not happy.
Now the judge knows how they feel.
So the plea is set for tomorrow. I can't imagine anything's going to change. And if the state pulls it off the table, that looks really awkward now, because all of the jury that could potentially sit in this case would know that he was going to plead guilty. So that kind of hurts the whole "I didn't do it" defense.
I do see. We talked about Kaylee, who was murdered. Her sister posted on Facebook, and maybe this is a reason. I'm not sure. But Bryan Kohberger facing a life in prison means he would still get to speak, form relationships, and engage with the world. Meanwhile, our loved ones have been silenced forever. That reality stings more deeply when it feels like the system is protecting his future more than honoring the victim's past. But I don't understand. Is he going to have additional privileges with life in prison that he wouldn't have had on death row?
No, he'll be in max. He'll be in supermax. He'll be treated the same as a death row inmate. He'll be wearing handcuffs anytime he walks outside. He'll be able to speak to other inmates. I guess his family can come visit him.
But so can death row inmates, can't they?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Well, what she's saying is he'll be able to speak forever. He'll be able to do these things.
And
yes, no finality.
And also he would be on death row for a really long time.
Right. Now I can understand both sides of this. The state should have given them the heads up, and then their arguments would have had a little less weight.